Hello. Everybody stay seated, please. All right, stragglers. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Noelle Phillips. I'm on the board of directors here at the Denver Press Club, and I help organize events. If you have a panel in mind, let me know. We'll talk. We'd love to have you and your guests here at the club. I've been a reporter for 30 years, and I think there are two crises in our industry. One is how to pay for the news, and the other is the burnout facing the journalists who work in our industry. When I started in 1992, at any given day, there'd be a group of reporters that would go to lunch for 2 hours, and no one would say, "Where's that story that you had coming to put online right now?" Now journalists shovel food at their desks, racing to get dailies updated constantly, and their weekenders finished to meet deadlines. Not that 2-hour lunches will solve the burnout problem, but it is an indicator of how our industry has changed in the pace that we work at, with fewer people trying to do more work in a 24-hour news cycle. So without further ado, one more thing. If you're watching online, you can ask questions in the chat channel, and we will be forwarding those to the panel. About 20 minutes left, 8:40, we'll be coming around to collect those cards we passed out and take your questions. We'll try to get through as many of them as we can. So now on to Tina Griego, who will lead this panel and do all the introductions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Can you hear me back now? I just want to echo very quickly what Noelle said, and that is, this is a sprawling, complicated, emotional topic, and I know that there are people in this room and there are people who are watching who are hurting, and so I just want to acknowledge that. I want to just ask that we extend grace in this conversation and in the conversation online as well, because it is hard. It is a really tough challenge, and when we leave, I really want us to leave kind of buoyed by what we heard here today by this really excellent panel, and thinking about what we can change rather than what we can't. And so we have like a tight deadline, which I just intruded on. So I'm going to introduce the panel. This is Dr. Mark Monks. He is a pulmonary critical care MD who has been working in burnout research for 2 decades. This is Elizabeth Hernandez from the Denver Post. I think most of you know her. She is an outspoken advocate for local news. Linda Shapley, I work with the Denver Post. She's a managing editor at Colorado Politics and a fine human being. And I'm Tina Griego, longtime journalist. I work for Collab. Give me, Ceylin, I can't see you. Ceylin Hong, we're so happy to have Ceylin. Ceylin is an HR director from NPR. And so this is our panel. I want to actually start right away by kind of just tackling a couple of tropes. I've been talking to a lot of people about burnout, and so I want the panel to we're just going to dive right in. And these tropes, they fall along kind of generational and hierarchical lines, and they tend to overlap in your little Venn diagram. And one of them is, they're all around burnout and how we view burnout. So one of them is kind of ceaselessly demanding editor who was formed in the suit up and suck it up school of journalism, who kind of looks at this like maybe this is not something you should be doing. And on the other are journalists who are ceaselessly churning and who are really formed in the digital age. And so there's a kind of voraciousness about the pace, the slings and arrows of social media. And they really tend to kind of come from a point of view that I hear, which is basically like, you all old like me. You put your mental health in a box, and you stuffed it under the bed, and we are not going to do that. And so the first question, actually I'm going to start with Elizabeth. The first question is really like, what does that framing, reductionist as it is, what does that framing miss? And then very quick, like one sentence, because we're going to dig in, how do you define burnout?
Yeah, so I would say to that old school realm of thinking of, we never thought about this before, I would say, yeah, I can tell, because how do we think the industry is doing? I would say it's in shambles, and I don't think anyone would argue with me in saying like, oh, the journalism industry is doing great. I'd say it's very apparent that we never thought about that before and didn't really address it. And I think it's long past due that we do something about it and start talking about it, because why would we keep perpetuating something that is clearly broken? And as far as what burnout means to me, I just a tiny longer than one sentence, but I'll be very quick. So at my peak burnout in 2018, I had a recurring dream in which I was behind the wheel of a car and it was going through a forest and there were lions swiping at the car and the forest was on fire and then the car went off a cliff and I was sinking in a body of water. And that is what burnout feels like for me. Just like very overwhelming, dread, all-consuming, and exhaustion that it's just like all-consuming. So.
So one of the things that I think that the framing perhaps gets wrong is that it's not us versus them. I'm speaking as an editor. It's more about the culture of the newsroom that you're in, and that there are ways to approach it where people don't feel like, in a lot of ways we're all very passionate about what we do, and you want to, and organizations that haven't worked at it right don't feed, they take advantage of the passion as opposed to supporting it and making it feel better. And I think that's one of the places where, kind of as a manager who came up in the middle of, the tough it out kid versus the, we need to take better care of ourselves. I feel like that's where managers should really start to be. In terms of burnout, my story is always, I had somebody tell me, well, you're kind of a workaholic. And it's like, well, you can be a workaholic without being burned out, but it is being able to recognize that in yourself and being able to say, I'm doing something that I'm passionate about, but I can't let it burn me out. And when I'm burned out, I have no joy in what I'm doing. So that'll be that.
We're going to do a say-lin and then we
Hi. Love the virtual mic. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So to me, I think the framing just really misses something really unique about this year. To me, this year was really the eye-opener that, it was just something that was kind of incredibly challenging and something that everybody went through in their own way. Don't know anyone, frankly, whether it's an employee at an organization or friends in my personal life or family who haven't had a sense or felt a sense of burnout at some point over this very long drawn out. Now I can't even keep track anymore of how long it's been. And I've definitely found that if we can recognize that, that everyone's going through something, I believe and hope that would help us have empathy for one another. And I actually think that that's just essential to effectively addressing burnout in the workplace as well. To reach that point of commonality first. And I've definitely seen those tropes, whether it's management versus employee. In my role in HR, part of my role is also directing labor relations. And so, at NPR, we also have a very highly unionized population. So there's also that trope that I've heard in the past, at least, of, union or management, and how they sort of work together as well. And I think we've really, over the past year, really effectively kind of worked together and found common ground on things to try to address this problem.
Thank you.
So I'm the non-journalist in the room, so I feel like a fish out of water here. I do read papers though, so. And, yeah. So, just to frame it a little bit, for the last 16 months, I've spent almost every day in an intensive care unit caring for COVID patients. And I think the important, if you're gonna look for silver lining, is that it makes it a lot easier for our society to talk about these issues and acknowledge that it's been tough. So I think we've been talking about this for 20 years. This has existed in medicine forever. When I first started to do research on this and talk about it, I'd give talks at national meetings and people, or at other institutions, prestigious hospitals. At the end of it, people come up to me and go, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't see this at our institution. And it was really, they didn't want to admit that there were these issues at their institution. So that's a little bit of the framing. In terms of the definition of burnout, I think it's important. There are two things. Number one, it's an occupational health problem. By definition, it's something related to the work. And I think it's important to frame it that way because it's not something inherently wrong with the individual. It's just part of your job description. The other part of it that I think is important is that it's a difference between what you thought your job was going to be and what you're actually doing. So you guys all went into journalism issues, are going to uncover some important story, you're going to break the whole Watergate scandal or whatever, and really show that there are problems and make the world a better place. But sometimes that's not what you do on a daily basis. So it's that discrepancy of what you thought the job was and what you're actually doing.
So keep in mind, because I'm actually, can you dig a little deeper into the difference between, I think it's interesting, the difference between what I was thinking was mental health and you're defining as occupational health. What's that? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I think another part of that is, burnout, I think, is an okay term because it's, people came in, oh, I'm burned out, I want to talk about it, right? So it's kind of led the charge. But I think also people think it's not an important thing. But it is, and I think it's an umbrella term for deeper seated issues. When I hear people having nightmares about work, that could be post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? There could be depression, there can be an anxiety. In the medical profession, 400 doctors each year commit suicide. That's 2 medical school classes. Okay, 400 doctors do that, and that's not acceptable. So we call it burnout, but there are deeper-seated issues. And for us, working in an intensive care unit, that's a stressful situation. We see tragedy, and until Tina reached out to me, I didn't really think about it. Some of you that cover mass shootings, criminal justice issues, whatever, you see tragedy too. And I'm not thinking you learned how to deal with that in journalism. So there's a lot of similarities here. So we call it burnout, but there are deeper-seated psychological distress that I think is as important, if not more important.
Thank you. I wanted to just ask, I'll start with Saylin, actually. Saylin, can you, in addition to my, oh, sorry. Saylin, so in addition to some of the things that Mark just described about being overwhelmed, about trauma and things that lurk beneath the surface, can you tell me what your experience has been, in particular for journalists of color? What the added layer there is?
Of course, yeah. So I think this year, again, was very unique in the sense of like how many layers there are kind of added on top of one another. And I remember at one point talking to colleagues about, okay, like, can anything else happen? And then it was like something else has happened, and it almost seemed nonstop. And there was a layer of the pandemic and the relentless news cycle for our staff in the newsroom. And then in the midst of that raging pandemic, that definitely had implications, whether it meant limited staff on site, for example, or financial constraints our organization faced in hiring more staff because of the financial impact of the pandemic. in the midst of all that was sort of the country's reckoning, you know, with social injustice and systemic racism, and definitely found periods throughout the news cycle where that was re-traumatizing for some staff. Like, and I can think of certain stories, for example, coverage over the George Floyd trial, protests against, you know, systemic racism, the hate crimes targeting Asian Americans, and the Atlanta shooting, immigration policy, you know, I think things of that nature, this disproportionate impact of COVID. And so definitely was hearing from staff also about those type of, you know, unique issues that almost at a time when it was already hard to do the work that was required and things were growing just from the news cycle aspect, there was also trauma that had to be experienced, you know, just by doing your job. So that was a really, I think, industry specific impact that I saw.
And Elizabeth or Linda, are there any other things we should be throwing into the pot as we're defining what burnout has looked like and what contributes to it?
I would say a big part of my burnout is thinking about my future in this career, and just thinking on, I came into this career in 2015, thinking about my career since then, thinking about doing that again is like, oh my God, how am I gonna keep doing this? And every year it gets harder. Every year the industry gets worse. There's new challenges every year. And I'm like so young and I love this job and I wanna do it more than anything, but I'm just like, so exhausted already. How am I going to keep doing this year after year? So really just like thinking about the sustainability is part of my burnout.
Because I kind of span that, when I came into journalism, I was in the middle of the 1991 recession at that point. And so, you know, I had, you know, older grizzled veterans tell me, oh, the best days of journalism are behind us. You're never going to see anything like this. And, you know, just, you know, to see what we did and then how we grew and then to watch it slowly get chipped away has been something that, you know, leads you to days where it's like, I'm not getting out of bed today. And so I think that that's kind of where, you know, you reach those moments where I would tell people when I left the Post, there were parts of it when it was just hard on my heart. And so, and that's what I needed to change. And so that's always kind of, but you know, what I always figure is that if I was experiencing burnout and I was being like that, then it was going to infect the rest of the staff. And that's what I didn't want to happen, is that burnout can be very contagious. And if you're a leader, then, you know, you have to be able to understand, I see it in myself and I've got to do something to fix it. So.
Mark, I see you nodding. Can you?
But the contagious stuff's totally true. It's sort of, you know, we see this in different units where if one person or a few people get very negative, that just can permeate everybody. So the contagious stuff is totally a real thing.
So if we're going to summarize, we're summarizing the things that contribute. We're looking at being overwhelmed by the workload, not being prepared for some of the kind of traumatic experiences that we might be asked to cover, that we're carrying that with and don't know what to do with it. We have the kind of added layer the journalists of color are going through with the isolation. Of course, for all of us, we had a pandemic, we walked outside last summer and smelled wildfires and things burning down. Are there any other contributing factors?
Well, sorry if I'm talking too much. So, what do people want from the work environment? They want to feel appreciated and supported. And I think that's an important thing. If you're going to go back to an organization and say, like, what are we supposed to do? I think those are two things that I would add to it. People want to feel appreciated and supported.
Okay, so this is going to help us segue, because I know that we want to talk about what we're experiencing and what's contributing to it, but I know that an equally important part of this conversation is really what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? And so I want to shift gears just a little bit there, just to talk about going back to this idea of emotional, fascinated by that. And the idea then that burnout is not just an individual thing, it's a organization thing. So I guess I want to go to Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, we've had conversations in which you've talked about feeling like the onus to solve this is on the individual, and that really irritates the hell out of you, so take it.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's kind of naive and silly and almost like insidious to have an industry that is so demanding and is pretty abusive, I would say. I don't think that's hyperbolic, to its employees, and then be like, but we're throwing you a pizza party, so like everything's fine. Or like, you know, we're having a free yoga day once a year and like self-care. That to me is just like insane, and you know, a bubble bath is like not going to fix the fact that I just covered a mass shooting in a pandemic, and that I'm covering racial justice protests as a person of color, and that like I have 8 million things due, and you know, all of these things that compound. So yeah, I think it is an organizational thing and a culture thing, and we have to treat it that way. It's not just something like it's not like a weak versus strong person thing or like a personality issue. It's like an organizational thing that needs to be addressed. So
I want to ask both Linda and Lynn the same question, but the word you used, insidious. So this reminds me of a story that you have that I would like for you to tell. One of the earliest examples of how you got into this work with, I think it's Mr. Jones.
What do you want them to talk about?
No, actually, let's hear this story, because it speaks to the insidious nature of things and how an organization needs to change.
So this happened. This is when I realized, this was my aha moment, and we all had that. And so the way an intensive care unit in a hospital works, it's a little bit like on TV or whatever, is that you start in the morning and you round on patients. And you have a whole team, and there are residents and fellows and nurses and medical students. And once the residency hour issue became a big deal, that people couldn't work 36 hours in a row, like what we used to do, and there are a lot of similarities here. So as the person in charge of the team, there was a lot of pressure on getting people out of the hospital on time. So these people that were there overnight had to leave by 10 o'clock. So, and we have a lot of people to see, so we're standing outside in front of a patient's room and talking about their problems and coming up with their plan for the day. And, you know, talking about so-and-so's kidney failure, we'll say. And then, it's a true story, it sounds made up, but it's totally true. 3 rooms over, someone had a cardiac arrest and had a code blue, whatever you want to call it. So we ran into the patient's room and tried to resuscitate the gentleman, and he passed away. And me thinking I'm doing the right thing, okay, because we have to get people out and there's a lot of pressure on me. I turned to part of the team and I said, look, why don't you stay with Mr. Smith and get his paperwork done and call his family and call the coroner's office, and we'll continue to round. So I walked back to Mrs. Jones's room and said, okay, let's pick up where we left off and let's talk about her kidney failure. And I looked up and there was a 4th-year medical student on the service doing what's called a sub-internship. They're sort of learning how to be an intern. And she was crying. And I mean, you guys just met me, but I think I'm a nice person. I think I'm a caring person. And I looked up at the medical student and said, are you okay? And she said, yes. I said, what's wrong? And she goes, it's sad, as tears are streaming down her face. And I said, what's sad? And she said, that patient just died. And I had completely moved on. I was like, okay, he's died. We need to take care of these people. I got to get people out of here on time, and we got to keep going. And I realized what's happened to me. So that was my aha moment.
So that's you as an individual, but how did it translate organizationally? What changed?
As I said in the beginning, not a lot changed. I would give lectures, as I said, and people were like, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't see this in our institution. But what changed in healthcare that became this, prior to the pandemic, this was and still is the most important issue in healthcare. And what changed that is not so much concern about us as physicians, but when they realized that if your physician's burned out, you don't get as good care. And then people started to take notice.
So say, Lynn, can you draw any parallels to what you've seen in NPR and the organizational changes made there?
Yeah, I really love some of the points that were made by the other panelists. One theme that I think that's sticking out is sort of leading by example. You know, at NPR, we would have these weekly supervisors roundtables that we didn't have pre-pandemic. And one of the things we talked to our leaders about and supervisors about were just walking the walk, and just how their own actions would set the tone, right? So like, we can say all over and over again, like, take the time you need, you know, we're all burnt out, take some time off if you can, and try to set that up for folks, although it was harder for certain teams than others, and we really need to figure out other solutions. But, you know, I think leaders are realizing like, hey, if I don't take my own time off, or, you know, if I'm sending emails at 11 p.m., like, this is setting a tone for everybody else, like, even if I'm saying that, you know, you should take the time you need. And so we definitely saw more of that, which was encouraging. And I think that really helped a lot, to have leaders sort of leading by example. And I think that was definitely a tone that I was seeing. And I think it's something, you know, Linda said, and also what Mark just talked about, that really triggered that memory for me as one of the experiences. The other thing I wanted to say super quickly that really struck me about what Mark said was sort of the definition of burnout, of your sort of like your job description not matching what you're actually doing. And I think that was it hit me that was a very unique part of this year, because I did see that the pandemic just created a lot of different kinds of work for people that they may not have been doing pre-pandemic. You know, and sort of without getting into details, but that was definitely sort of a theme. I think it just kind of added on an extra layer of work for folks that may have been sort of unprecedented and unexpected. And so I'm sure there was that disconnect there, and I wonder if that was a big part of the burnout too, in addition to other things we talked about.
Thank you. So, and then did you want to add?
You know, one of the things that I wish I had when I was coming up as kind of a middle manager is somebody who would talk to me about, here's how you need to manage people. And so I'm doing all of that now. So I listen to a podcast called Work Life, and I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's done by an organizational psychologist. His name is Adam Grant. And he does all of these various subjects, talking about creativity and talking about all these different elements, but he had one on burnout that I think I've listened to like 5 times. But, and it is that case of like, you know, supporting people in what you do, and that he breaks it down. I had to write it down so I wouldn't forget, but he breaks it down into that there's demands, there's control, and there's support, and that's what your staff needs in order to make sure that you're helping manage them. It's like you help manage the demands. So it's like, we all know in journalism, there's a lot that is, you know, going for your time. And that, am I going to go cover the racial justice protest for the 3rd time tonight? And that there's a demand that, you know, we're built that way, that we have to be there. And that it is being able to like stop and just take a moment to say, wait a minute, is this where we need to be? Or is it more important for us to be, you know, talking to, you know, this person tomorrow as opposed to covering the rage that's going on tonight? And so there were certain times, like, you know, after that first weekend where we definitely, you know, said, okay, we'll have our people there, but we're a public policy journal. We can see that without needing to be there. And so I told our people, get out of there. This is not a safe place for you. Let's step back let's make sure we're covering these things. And so it took away some of that demand. And then, giving them the control to say, I have a better story that I think I can do this, but I'm gonna need to step away from being the breaking news person today. It's like, okay, let's make that happen. And then just finding those different ways to support people. But I can't say enough good about what I learned, just kind of like listening over and over again to somebody talk about, here's how you help people really, get some control back and understand burnout.
So I find that really interesting because I think that we all know that there are some big structural things going on that they're pretty immovable. I don't see it, though I wish it to be so. I don't see newsrooms going on hiring sprees, because we all know that one thing that would really help would be to have more people doing the work, right? So I don't see it as, there are budget constraints, there are some owners who are sucking marrow from bone, and I don't see those going away. So what you're talking about is how do we make changes around those? Maybe we don't give up on those other things, right? But that's our reality right now. Our reality right now is tough. So when we're talking about things that we can change around those, demand, control, support is one. And then Mark, what would you recommend? What has worked?
So I was just hearing what you guys were saying. I think there's so many similarities here that I never thought about before. Part of being a doctor working in an intensive care unit is there's an adrenaline rush, right? Like, you gotta get the tube in the right place. The person dies, I got the tube in the right place. This is awesome. And it's the same way, I was starting to think about, watching these reporters cover, like, here we are in this revolution, there are tanks riding down this and et cetera. There's a revolt going on and civil unrest, and there could be some danger here. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think there are some similarities where there's this adrenaline junkie part of being a journalist. And that wears on you after a while. When you're in your 20s, it's pretty cool. You get to be my age, it's not as cool anymore because you've done it for a while. So I think there are inherent parts that attracted people to the profession that are just part of the profession you have to address. I think what Tina wanted me to talk about is, I think part of the problem with these things are killers, okay? You can get some people worry about getting vaccinated as putting a microchip in your arm. We already have it, okay? If anybody wants to know where you are, they know we're all in this room together right now. It's a microchip, essentially. So we gotta set limits on how available people are. And what we've done in our division, now if it's a patient care issue, that's different. It's a policy, we don't fine anybody, but you don't send emails after 6 o'clock at night or before 7 in the morning or on the weekends, period. If it's that important, pick up a phone and call someone. Because it sets this expectation, like if you get an email from your boss at 10 o'clock at night with 4 other people on it, and you're the only one that doesn't answer the email, makes you look like you're not doing your job properly. The other thing I would say, we can get into more depth maybe over a beer or whatever, but the way our jobs are set up are so inefficient. And email is a killer that way. What are you doing? Can you meet at 3? What about at 2? What about pick up the phone and call someone? And Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, it's just not the way we're supposed to spend our day. What you guys are supposed to do is what's called deep thinking, to write a really good article, right? And really think about what the issues are. But that's not what people are doing anymore. They're just spending their whole day answering emails, and then they're exhausted at the end of the day. So I think you can restructure any job description to get back to, you signed up to do this, so let's do that and not do, just answer emails all day. Because then you're writing your article at 9 o'clock at night after you put your kids to bed, and that's not what you signed up for.
Does anyone want to add any other could change, that would be helpful.
Hell yes. That's kind of where I am with that. But yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things is that we do get, like there's the adrenaline rush when you're on a story, but I think giving people time to kind of like come down from that is also something that's really important. Just like, I know you've been covering this really rough story, I need to, and so, it's like recognizing in the schedule, this is how we're going to, take that back, and here's how we're going to, break that cycle if we can. And that, it is a case of where, I swear last summer it was impossible to pull some people off of stories because they were like, we need to be here. This is where I need to be. And it's like, no, you're getting tear gas, get out. And, it's that sort of thing where sometimes it's like, I understand that you want to be there, but let's find a different way because it will not be great for you if you continue to do that. And so you don't want to shame people into feeling like, you're working to, you shouldn't be working or this is bad, but you do want to make them understand that we have to be thinking about the bigger picture, that it's, in a previous job, I worked with Franklin Covey, which, leadership and leadership mantras and everything like that. They said, put the important over the urgent. And that's what every journalist does, is says, okay, I'm working on this really important story, it's gonna be great, and oh my God, there's a fire. And so, everybody goes for the urgent. And so I think it is trying to like make sure you're keeping that top of mind, that there are things that are more important than what's happening right over there. And to, for everybody to feel like I need to have that conversation and being comfortable going to your boss and saying, I can, I need to do this, and listening to it. So.
I'm going to open it for questions in 1 second, but say then, I want to know if we could take the same question, but with a little twist, because I have been speaking to editors and to managers, and another part of your job is talking to managers, and what I often hear is, I don't know what to do. It looks different for everybody. I don't know if this is somebody who's just exhausted. I don't know if there's an underlying mental health issue going on, and I just don't know what to do. And so I'm wondering what your counsel is to managers.
Yeah, I feel like we've been saying a lot this year because part of my role at NPR is to manage a team of business partners, HR business partners. And so part of their role is to provide some individualized coaching to managers and work with them one-on-one, and also support employees on a kind of one-on-one basis as well. In addition to some of the, the larger webinars or trainings or interactive sessions that were held on some of these issues. But definitely heard a lot of that this year on multiple fronts. I can think of one example where a supervisor reached out just because they were just really did not know how to talk to someone about some of these, systemic racism type issues that were being covered and also just discussed sort of within, workplaces across America. And so I think that they were struggling with how to kind of open those conversations with their team, for example. On the flip side, hearing from employees where it's sort of like, oh, my manager, like this happened, on the news, for example, right? And like my supervisor didn't even ask me if I'm okay, or, and so some of this was just kind of, coaching around, like, taking some kind of action that was really meaningful to staff from the feedback that we were hearing. Even if you think you may, say the wrong thing, for example, like doing nothing speaks louder, I think, and had a greater impact to some of the staff. So there was that, but I think I mentioned we would have these sort of bi-weekly check-ins in addition to kind of the one-on-one individual type coaching sessions. And I would say like what we really try to focus on was tactical tools. And I think what you touched on was like, what is actually realistic in our environment? Like, and I'm really struck actually by how common this seems to be of overwork and just, maybe not enough resources. And it makes sense. I mean, we're in public media, right? And there are limited resources. So I think, some of those tactical tools were things like guidance around conversations with staff when we have limited resources, like state interview guides, for example, like what keeps you at NPR, like having those conversations, like what are your goals? Like, yes, we have limits right now, or we may have, financial constraints this year, but that's not always going to be the case. Like, let me help you plan this out or get there, right? Or how can I support you in your own career, for example, or just kind of reminders when things would happen to check in with staff, right? Like, so when some of the George Floyd trial coverage was happening, like checking in with Black staff was really important. And I think we were hearing from staff too that was meaningful when folks would check in. I know personally I was really affected by the shootings in Atlanta more than I expected, and I think that was also something I was hearing from when people were checking in, that it was really meaningful just to even get that acknowledgement. And we're having more conversations and trying to slowly build a culture. And I can't say that we're there, right? Like, because I think there's this thing of like, what's working and what's not. Like, and frankly, like, there's something that may work for someone, like, our EAP services that like someone else tells me like hasn't worked for them at all. And it's just some of it's very individualistic. But I think just building a culture where this is prioritized. It's the tone from everywhere, 360. And we're all kind of working towards that, and we're talking about it and trying to figure it out.
Thank you. I don't know where the questions are, but as I'm waiting for the questions, I do want to have each of you, I had said in our kind of pre-conversation that I would like you to offer people who are here, people who are watching, one thing, like they're gonna go to work tomorrow. What is one change they can make as individuals, or start to seek to change organizationally that you would urge them to do to get started?
I don't think anything's going to change until it gets destigmatized. Because there's a stigma about this. That's why I think it's an occupational issue, not a mental health issue. People got to tell you, I have cancer, then you have depression or PTSD. There's a mental health stigma in our country, and we have to destigmatize it. So I would say just people have to feel comfortable talking about it, which this is great, it's a start. But if people don't feel comfortable talking about it, that's not a perception that you're weak or you're not tough enough or you can't take it. We have to change that culture and destigmatize it.
I would say to think about what power you hold in your organization, if any, and use it to do the most good. So I am but a lowly reporter, but I wanted to have this discussion, so I helped organize this panel, and cool. But if you have more power than a lowly reporter, like, use that. That is awesome. Like, good for you. And let's like do some stuff and make changes and like rock the boat. And I know some days it's just like, let's survive and get through the day and not make things harder, but like nothing's gonna get better if we do that. So yeah.
So one of the things that I have a piece of paper that I've carried with me from job to job that I've done is I wrote down, be the person you needed when you were younger. And so as a leader, that's one of the things that I always try to do is I think back to when I was a lowly intern and a copy editor that worked from 6 at night until 2 in the morning, and what did I need? I needed somebody to notice that I was there and that I was working hard, and hey, great job making that catch. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm like, pay attention to people throughout the organization, know who everybody is, and that's kind of what helps me as a leader feel like this is what I hope that the other people that are working need. And so in my mind, there's professional like stature and there's personal stature, and that even though I didn't have a title, I always felt like I had some personal responsibility and leadership, and that would be the thing that would help me help others, and that we could all kind of grow as a good cohesive unit, as opposed to being, everybody's just kind of out for themselves. So.
Same.
Yeah, so there's a lot. So I'll try to keep it to just a couple. I think for me, I was really thinking about like the causes of burnout, right? And I think we touched on this a bit earlier in the panel. And some of that being, the overwork and then also just lack of clarity. And so one thing that I found helpful, is just this concept of prioritize. And I think this goes on the culture issue, instead of just adding to the immense workload that everybody already has, let's have these conversations where we're asking ourselves and asking our managers, and asking our teams, what do we need to prioritize this week? And I've tried to do this actually every Monday myself, and advise others to do this. I literally sit with my boss and I'm like, this is there's no way everything on this to-do list, right, is manageable. So what are the most important things to tackle this week, just to make sure that there's that clarity there and that there's always a manageable to-do list. I know that that's easier said than done for some, but I do think having an effort to have those conversations and clarity in expectations can be very helpful. And I think this kind of goes to some of what was touched on earlier around just understanding. One of the things that we did with some of our teams was just have casual, informal, it doesn't have to be formal team agreements. Teams would be meeting and basically talk about all right, here's how we like to communicate, whether that's email, Slack, text me. These are the hours we'll email, and most teams, I'm thinking, they did try to land on 6 p.m., 8 a.m., things like that. Here are the expectations for our team, what works for our team. I did this one with my own team too. And we just talked about our preferences and what works for us as a team. And I think that having that clarity could also be helpful in this type of burnout environment.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna start going through some of these questions. This one is from Sarah Martin. I'm an editor at my college newspaper and I see burnout in the place where the passion starts. Can we ingrain better practices in J school? Who wants to take that?
Yes, the answer is yes, we can. I think that, there's so little, at least for me, there was so little talk about mental health, or even now in the newsroom, few supports and resources in that way. I get therapy on my own, and that is great, and I recommend it for everybody if you're not already, and great for your brain. I think talking about mental health in J school would be so important in kind of building, better preparing students for this. Definitely need it.
Anyone else?
I totally wholeheartedly agree. I think changing the dialogue around it, or just for us, we had an admin program in place that provided additional support to some of the other leave policies that we have, and it was basically just admin leave. But when things were happening, when we were hearing that there were a lot of folks kind of struggling with specifically mental health challenges. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean, rising to the level of an accommodation, for example, right? We decided as an organization to implement policies that were, and announced it that would cover some of those additional needs, in this time of real deep need for things like that. I also on my end, I haven't found the answer to this yet, but being in HR, just really thinking around, on the benefit side, and even in the sort of accommodation space, I don't feel things are structured to support mental health specifically as well as it should, or chronic illness, for example. And so, this year we just implemented a short-term disability leave program. And even that, I feel there's still work to do, right? And I think part of that is recognizing, that we need to address it, and it's a real important part of folks' experience. So.
All right, thank you, Susan. What is your advice to journalists who don't work in the field, producers, digital, etc., who may not have the same front row seats to traumatic events, so they don't feel like they've earned the right to feel the trauma?
I feel qualified to answer this question because I was a copy editor, a designer, I was in production, always in the office. And oh my God, you are still seeing all of that. We looked through on 9/11, 900 images of what was happening, and it affects you. And I think that everybody comes to this with their own experience already, ingrained of whatever happened to them when they were younger, whatever they feel emotionally. I mean, we all sat in our living rooms, during the pandemic, and were working alone, sitting in front of a computer, which was just as traumatic as, being worried about the reporter who's out there on the scene and what's going on there. And so there's no reason to invalidate that trauma as well. So, I mean, I think that everybody comes to it with their own experience, and you have to accept that, it's not like anybody's more worthy than anybody else in terms of like, well, I feel it worse than you do. And I think actually Mark and I talked about this earlier, because so many times people be like, well, it's not like you're a doctor, it's not like, and so it's like, but, we all experience that in our own ways. So.
We're coming up against time, and apparently multiple people have asked a version of this question, which is to each of the panelists, and how to find balance, personal stories or tips from each of you. How do you all find balance? Start with you.
I think it's setting expectations of what you want out of your life and out of your profession, and realizing that there's only 24 hours in a day, and you can't take, what we say is, you can't take care of your patients if you're not taking care of yourself. So you have to take care of yourself to be able to do this. So what do? I put on my calendar going to work out. And if someone calls up and says, can you meet at 5? I'm like, no, I can't. What about tomorrow? So I set boundaries on what I'm able to do. Oh, you're going to be away on vacation. There's this really important conference call. Can you call in? No, I can't. Let me know how it goes. Happy to respond to it when I come home. I set boundaries. Now, I'm older, okay, and I might not have done that in the beginning, but I think, again, it gets back to the culture. It's why you shouldn't be sending emails at 10 o'clock at night. If the culture allows you to set boundaries, then it's not a perception that you're weak or not tough enough. It's just that becomes the culture.
I would say I'm really lucky in that I actually have an editor who is like really cognizant of this stuff, and he's sitting over there, thank you. So I am able to communicate like, I am not doing well today or whatever, and he understands that and takes that seriously. But outside of that, I also think like commiserating with your friends and your colleagues is really helpful for me, at least. And I don't know what I would do without that support system. Just like finding a support system that works for you would probably be my biggest piece of advice. And also seeking out mental health help, even if you don't think you need it. It is so helpful and has helped me tremendously in just being a reporter. So that would be what I would say.
Anybody who works for me knows that I have a real problem with balance. I have a tendency, because I am a workaholic, I'm kind of like, okay, well, I'm not gonna work on this now because I'm gonna go work on this, which is gonna be really fun. And so that's kind of where I end up, turning my work to something else. I volunteer in a couple of boards, and I really, I look for the small wins. And that's kind of what helps keep me going. I look for, it's like, hey, I helped participate in a freelance forum at my alma mater, and that made me feel really good because it was an opportunity to help emerging journalists get to where they needed to be. And I just, and so that's always kind of like what I'm doing in order to help, stave things off. But like I said, I tell many members of my staff all the time, don't be like this, but but it is kind of what, I find a different thing that I like to work on.
Say, Lynn?
Yeah, I think I really just relate a lot to what Linda just said, but at the same time, I think a lot of changes happened over the pandemic where I actually discovered a hobby that's really allowed me to really just like disconnect. And prior to that, I was one of those people where I was like always embarrassed because you'd be like, "What's your hobby?" or like, "What's a fun fact?" And I'm like, I can't think of anything, but with the gardening, which is what I'm doing, I think it just really just all I thought about was taking weeds out, and it just I could do that for long stretches, and that's definitely been my escape.
So we are actually right at time. I do have more questions. If you were all going to be around afterward and beer might be free flowing, we could continue this conversation. But I just wanted to make sure that there was nothing else you wanted to add that you didn't get to say, I didn't ask.
I did want to add one thing because I feel like the question about like as an individual, right? Like, what could I do tomorrow potentially? And I frankly, like one of the reasons I love kind of working in, a mission-driven organization, I guess, and public media is just the inspiration I get from staff. And I'm finding that, anyone in staff can really make a difference. Like I think about the best presentation I saw at NPR about burnout, and it was literally staff created. And it was just, hey, like part of it was like, okay, how do we have a better meeting culture? Like we got to, ask ourselves, like, do we need this meeting, for example, right? So, and I think just seeing staff support each other, like peer-to-peer support groups, like I feel like a lot of those kind of efforts are also happening informally or, commiserating with your buddy at work, like those types of connections at work, I think are really important. And I should have said, like, that's probably one of the other really key things, like having a real, close relationship or people you could talk to at work. To me, that's been really key. And I'm finding with staff too that I do think you can make a difference as an individual for sure.
Thank you. And I am really sorry for those of you someone's giving me who I did not get to, but please, I encourage you to engage in conversation, and I thank you so much for your attention. I thank the audience there for
I would invite everybody to hang out for a while here. We've got bars open upstairs and downstairs. We have a partnership with Bar Red. We have a menu that you can talk to a bartender about ordering, and we have a guy who will run over there and get it and bring it back for you. So help yourself to that. We're open until 10 and we're glad to have you. If you're not a member and you're interested, come talk to me, Laura Frank, Beck and Jurgen. We're all on the board and we can help you out with that. Thanks.